information, a lot of part numbers, obviously the shocks are different. The RXC has, if the middle doesn't work for you, you're kind of screwed. Back in the shop with these two 858 hot rods here, we got the 137 RXC, the 129 SnoPro over here. Gonna go and try and do a deep dive of sorts on these. I spent a couple hours this morning and some time yesterday going through the parts diagrams and kind of comparing all the part numbers and spring rates and pieces parts to see what exactly is officially different between these two and what is the same. So that way I can go over and relay that all to you guys. I figure the best way to go about doing it is to just kind of compare the visuals first of what is visually different on these things. I'll take the camera, I'll walk around, I'll point some stuff out, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into the technical side of what is exactly different on these. So let's get into it. Starting off, obviously, the graphics package is different on these things, right? On the ZR, you got a little bit lighter of a green here, almost got a yellowish kind of tint to it. Just the overall graphics package is different. Your front nose cones are pretty much exactly the same. They say Catalyst, they got the little green cat on there. The ZR does have a different Arctic Cat logo here than the RXC does, but since we got the G8 gauge and the gauge pod and stuff, we don't have those logos directly on here yet. They are ordered, so when they come in, we'll throw those on. Spindles are the same green. Ski loops are the same green. The skis are the same. Spindles are the same part number. Control arms, sway bar, all that stuff is the same between the two. Both sway bars are 11.1 millimeter. All your console stuff and layout there, the controls are all the same. The brake masters are indeed the same. Throttle blocks are the same. On your throttle block, you do have these little serrations down here on the bottom side. My guess for that is that if you're one who turns really sharp and then you roll under and do one of these numbers, you have a little bit of extra grip here on the bottom of the throttle block. So it's kind of a small little detail that might not be very well known. I don't know if this is going to pick it up. It's kind of dark under here, but we got little serrations back here. It's relatively apparent that the RXC comes with handguards and the SnoPro, and I don't think any of the other models come with handguards. I think the RXC is the only one that comes standard with handguards. I'm going to be swapping mine out for the like ProCross style LED ones. Visually, as far as the tunnels go, they both have 2 points for two different attach systems. You obviously on the 137 do have a little bit more space back here between your last attach point and where the bumper cover tail light hole housing starts. Seats are obviously different in the cover department. The lower section down in through here is all the same, but the RXC has the little strips on the top, little ribbies. They both do have the little square cut out in here. You can kind of see there's a little bit of this square recess kind of thing here for the seat heater system if you go for a heated seat option. These ribs are kind of like a racing feature to help keep you from sliding back. You know, they kind of catch your gear and help keep you forward on the seat. One last little bit to touch on in the controls department is that they both have the exact same handlebar part number. They have the same risers, the 3.5 inch. All that stuff is essentially the same. So you're not getting anything different handlebar wise with an RXC than you would with the SnoPro. So if you're familiar with the Polaris VR1 versus XCR, the XCRs have a different handlebar than the VR1s, but that is not the case between these two here. Since a good base of my channel is Polaris based, I'm going to compare some of the upcoming spring rates and suspension information to the Polaris equivalent. So those guys that are very familiar with those models kind of have something to relate back to. I have a couple Skidoo spring rate part numbers here, but again, with all of the spring rate and suspension info, it's important that we keep in mind that the geometries are completely different. So these rates are not apples to apples in that regard. I just wanted to get that out there because it is important that we keep in mind that since these motion ratios and the geometries are different, our spring rates aren't direct comparisons apples to apples amongst the brands. With that being said, let's dig into the front suspension of these two models here from Arctic Cat, and then I'll give you some spring rates of the other guys. The front shock stuff and the geometry of the front ends, while the spindles are totally different and their roll centers and center of gravities are all very drastically different, the spring and the way that the front shock and whole system works is somewhat similar. So that rate, we can kind of get a good idea of how the front ends are going to ride in that regard. But again, let's just keep in mind, we've got different stuff going on here. So I've got a little cheat sheet with me here because A lot of different part numbers, a lot of numbers floating around. I've got a good handle on this stuff, but I don't want to mess anything up, so it's better if I just kind of have my whole parts breakdown of stuff I researched this morning and wrote down here in front of me so I can relay things accurately, right? Moving forward, in terms of front suspension stuff here, right? Obviously the shocks are different. The RXC has the QS3Rs, which have rebound adjustment down here on the bottom of the shaft, along with your traditional QS3 3-position up front. And then over on the SnoPro, we've got the AC5, AC5S, I believe. I think there's an S at the end of that. Either way, if you're watching this video, you're probably somewhat familiar with the differences, that this is a new shock from Arctic Cat that has 5 positions instead of the 3 over here. I love the idea of these simpler to adjust shocks, right? Giving people adjustments, but not making it overwhelming with 16 clicks of high and low compression and all that. AC5 is great. You've got 5 positions to split your damping all the way across the board, from soft to hard, 5 positions. It's great. That gives you just enough window there to adjust this and tailor it into what you want. The QS3, I think, did a great job of getting that whole movement started and still giving people adjustments, but not making it too overwhelming. However, I don't think 3 is enough. I think going from soft at full open to right in the middle to full stiff is just, you're very, very limited, right? If the middle doesn't work for you, you're kind of screwed, because full stiff is going to be way too stiff and full soft is most likely going to be too soft. Great idea. Sounds good, doesn't work, right? If we go and move on to the springs, the RXC comes standard with a 120 pound, 10.5-inch long spring. So that means it's 120 pounds per inch of compression force. The SnoPro over here is coming standard with a 95 pound spring at 10.5 inches long as well. And that long length is your free length extended. If you pull it off of the sled and stand it on the bench and measure it, you're 10.5 inches long. Now with those 2 rates in mind, I feel like this SnoPro 95 pound rate is a really good middle ground for the majority of people. This is gonna work awesome. If you compare this to your Polaris side of things, your VR1 comes with an 80 pound, which is a little bit too soft of a straight rate. It doesn't really have enough there to catch massive hits if you really start turning things up. But then if you go to like the Assaults with a 100 pound rate, you lose a little bit of your small bump compliance. So I'm curious to see how this 95 does, because honestly, 5 pounds on the start rate isn't really that drastic of a difference. So I'm curious again to see how this is through all the small chop and how compliant it is. Whereas this thing with 120 pound, that's a pretty stiff spring up front. Essentially, I don't think that this is gonna be nice and smooth and kind of just absorb all your stutter bumps. You're gonna be kind of chattering on top of it, because you're not really gonna have enough force to compress into this 120 pound spring until you start turning it up into that bigger 8-inch, 10-inch chop type trail trash. But again, if you're buying an RXC, that's not your target. Like, your target is not plush compliance everywhere. You want a sled that you can just hop on and pound through whatever comes up in front of you. If you're looking for a broad spectrum compliance type deal, this is gonna be closer out of the box than this is, in my just first impression assumption of looking over what we've got in these sleds as far as the calibrations go. And I don't want this to come out as like, this needs to be watered down. No, RXC and XRS and XCR should go back to like the 2010.5 or the 2007 XRS, where you're buying essentially a race sled because you want to have that stuff. You shouldn't be buying an XRS or an RXC or a race sled and saying, hey, this thing's too stiff, I need to water it down. No, buy the next level down. Anyway, we're not gonna keep onto that rant too much. That's essentially what you've got going on for the differences up front here. Like I mentioned briefly earlier, the sway bars are the same diameter, so in terms of roll stiffness, you've got the same thing going there, although your spring rate does affect that. It's a little bit more of an in-depth discussion I've talked about doing on the channel before, but it's tough to film all of that and plan around how to convey all of that. But that's neither here nor there. Let's keep moving on suspension-wise. All right, moving on to the rear suspension stuff. I don't know how else to do this other than kind of just get down here like this. So it's kind of awkward to lay here, but it is what it is. Front track shock and stuff here, right? We're on the 129 SnoPro looking at this thing. All in all, this new skid here is very interesting. I think it's going to be very fun on the trail, and I'm really curious to just see how it works overall, and just the broad window of how this thing is going to be is very exciting to think about. You've got a really long torsion spring mounted way up in front of the torque arm mount at the back here. So essentially what this is going to do is, as the front of this skid starts to encounter bumps and it comes up, it's going to incorporate this torsion spring almost immediately. As soon as this starts to lift, you're using this torsion spring to provide assistance with the front track shock. This is something that I experimented with last year using the cross-country springs on the Polaris cross-country and retrofitting those to the VR1s, because this is an awesome move. The R-Motions did this way back in the beginning. I really like to see this torsion spring mounted up here because it really does help keep the front track shock from bottoming out. It keeps the whole skid working together, and it does help keep the sled tracking straighter through the big bumps, and it doesn't allow the sled to kind of kick and pitch as much. It helps keep things a little bit more calmed down and settle through the bigger stuff, which with the shorter tracks, as we know, they can dance around a little bit. So this whole system here hopefully should keep this thing really calm through the big stuff, or calmer than your traditional 129 if the torsion spring were mounted back in here. Touching on the front track shock again as well, that is also an AC5. You got your 5 positions. If it is AC5S, apologies for that, but it's in my head as AC5, so that's what we're gonna keep saying. But yeah, you got your 5 position adjusters. On this, they are running a 90 to 250 pound progressive spring. So what that means is it starts at a 90 pound rate, and by the time you get all the way through the stroke, it takes 250 pounds per inch to compress that spring. So what that does is allows that front track shock to be kind of compliant and smooth over the small chop, but then hopefully it still has enough spring force there to catch when that arm hits something really sharp, really fast, or a big G out on the bottom. Hopefully you have enough spring rate to catch that momentum and speed there. We've seen on the Polaris stuff running a 90-80 that front track shock gets too much momentum, but on your standard Polaris sleds like the VR1 and the XCR running traditional torsion springs that are mounted back here, that front track shock has no assistance to catch those sharp movements. With this and the torsion spring mounted way up here, it should be a lot better, which I discovered and confirmed on my VR1 testing with the long tail springs mounted up in front of the torque arm, that you do get a lot more additional bottoming resistance having that torsion spring tied in. So this again is all awesome to see. If this torsion spring weren't mounted up here, I would say that this rate is going to be too soft, but with the spring mounted up here, I think we're in a good spot. Oh my God. Okay, switching it up a little bit because that arm's getting tired. Oh, this is even worse. It's worth touching on, I guess, the idler wheels here. The idler wheels are different between a SnoPro and an RXC. You are looking at, I think that's under my miscellaneous. All right, so on your SnoPro, you're looking at a 5.50 inch spoked idler wheel, whereas the RXC has a 5.63 inch idler wheel with no spokes, which I'm assuming is probably a different material plastic. It's gonna be a little bit stronger for the RXC for hammering through all the trash all the time. The size difference is a little bit interesting to me. So I don't know if that means that the mounting location is a little bit different, or potentially the overall extrusion of the rail and where things are located is different. I'm gonna have to do a little bit more in-depth measuring on that, but your overall wheel diameter is slightly different between the two. Fun bit here, the SnoPro and the RXC, and I'm assuming most of these Arctic Cats are coming with 2 limiter straps, which is awesome. Continuing on with the skid and suspension here at the back of the SnoPro 129, your upper arm mounts directly to the tunnel here, whereas on the RXC you have a traditional style lever arm in there. Does some geometry stuff, not gonna get too crazy into that. You've got kind of a standard stamped steel rod here for the rear track shock linkage and all that. Torsion spring uncoupled at the back. There is enough meat there where if you wanted to play with this, I assume you could go ahead and drill and put in a coupler of some sort, but depending on what this does geometry-wise and ratio, I probably wouldn't go doing that, because if they wanted a coupler, they would have put a coupler in it. Standard Arctic Cat 8-inch wheels out back. You've got 3 wheels, traditional axle setup like they've had for quite a while now. I would definitely recommend for most people going to the J&T axle setup, because I don't like how the adjuster bolt pushes directly on the axle of this. The plastic supports, if you're not doing a lot of tail landings and you're not putting a ton of force through that rear axle all the time, the plastic supports are fine. But just the adjuster on the direct axle shaft alone, I don't really love. And that's where that J&T axle kind of is awesome and why I'm kind of pushing it, just because those billet ends help with the strength and they get that adjuster off of the shaft. In regards to this rear torsion spring here, let's talk about that real quick. On the SnoPro, which the non-SnoPro, I think the regular Attack, I did not look up the part numbers for those. I've only got the part numbers and rates for the SnoPro and the RXC. So apologies if you have one of those and we're curious about that, but this already took me quite a while. So let's just continue on with what we got here. You're looking at a 0.359 inch square bar or square spring stock. The tail is at 100 degrees and you're looking at 12 pounds per degree. So to move this tail 1 degree takes 12 pounds of force. And that's usually how these are rated. Rear track shock, AC5 again, 5 positions. I like this shock package and setup a lot. If they offered an RXC and a 129, I probably would have gotten it, but I don't think it would have had the AC5s. It probably would have had QS3Rs. Either way, I like what they're doing here. I think this sled is going to be awesome for 95% of people. This is going to be the ticket. That said, let's move over to the RXC and kind of check out the back of that thing. Pretty awkward, pretty uncomfortable. I got a ski loop in my back, but this is the best I can think of aside from putting them way up on the lift. Same thing again, starting at the front of the skid and working our way back. On the RXCs here, we have a different 137 than the traditional 137 slide action that's found in like the Sidewinders and Procross and whatnot. This one, on my measurements, which is easiest for me to measure, was to go from the end of the little slide action fork where it goes over the front axle here, down to the center of the bolt. This torque arm is 4 inches longer than the one in the 2025 Sidewinder over there, which is substantial to say the least. What that longer arm does is it kind of reduces the angle of this arm, right? If it's shorter, it's mounted up here, which increases the angle. And that loosely translates to the longer and flatter this is, the less anti-squat that this rear skid is going to have in this section here, which means it's not going to separate and wheelie as much. It's going to be a little bit more stable, a little bit more planted and consistent across its on-off throttle inputs, which for a cross-country style race sled like this is what you kind of want to it's kind of what you want to keep a consistent handling machine, right? Something that Skidoo also did was on their R-Motion X, they lengthened this arm and they changed that geometry, and it kind of made the sleds a little bit more boring. People aren't saying that they're as fun, they don't transfer as much. Now, talking about that change and saying that lengthening that arm and taking the anti-squat out, oh my God. Now, having said that, I don't want people to think that lengthening this arm and everything is going to immediately make this machine dull and boring. Out in the field and at the dealership and blasting around in there, it still transfers right back, hits the coupler, it pulls the skis up. It still has that fun factor. I think they've just found a very good balance where this is going to be planted and consistent when you want it to be, but you still have that ability to make it playful if you want. And if this current coupler block location is not enough and you want more transfer, you can go ahead and move it back because they're giving you options on the RXC for mounting that coupler block, which is incredible. I'm one that likes options and positions to move things and adjust and play with stuff. Again, I can see how that is kind of somewhat daunting possibly, and like you don't want to change stuff all the time. But on a model like this, where you're kind of buying an out-of-the-box race sled, we want those adjustments, we want to see that. So again, thank you, Arctic Cat, for giving us this machine that has these adjustments. Moving back to the front torque arm, I love this change. I'm very curious to see how these two sleds are different and how they ride and react differently. Also, again, with the Sidewinder, with the normal, quote-unquote, 137 slide action, to compare all of that, which, again, 4-stroke, totally different machine. Still, we can kind of get a little bit of a feel for how the skids react hopping around different sleds. While we're still up front here, we've got 2 limiter straps. Going to our front track shock, we've got a regular QS3 here. No rebound on the front track shock. Spring rate on our front track shock on this RXC is a hog. We've got a 250-pound straight rate front track shock spring, which is quite stiff for a front track shock spring. On my dual rate stuff, I usually run a 250 main, so when it crosses over and gets to that, it's a 250, but it's softer in the initial, so it can take up some of the small stutter bumps. I think I'm gonna feel a lot of stuff in my feet on this, but I'm not worried about bottoming that front track shock on pretty much anything with a 250-pound straight. So that's a bit of a boy in there. That's a substantial spring. Again, if you're buying an RXC, I wouldn't be going into it expecting some super compliant machine that's going to soak up all the little 4-inch stutter bumps. That's not what this is meant for, and I don't want to see Arctic Cat water this down to meet that demand. If you're buying this, you got to know it's going to be stiff. If you want something compliant, again, look to a different model. Moving back, our rear track shock is again a QS3, but this is also an R, so this has rebound on it up at the top of the shaft. You're gonna need a little screwdriver to get up in there. Gonna be a short little stubby guy to get between the track and everything, but you do have rebound adjust on that, which is awesome because having that rebound helps you tailor things into how you want, especially with a beefy boy rear torsion spring like this. In regards to that rear torsion spring, we're looking at a 0.394 square bar or square stock with a 90-degree start point, so less preload starting point than the SnoPro. However, the poundage is a 16.5 pound per degree, so that's a pretty stiff spring at the back as well. And you can see possibly in the videos when I was moving it around and pulling it off of the dollies, you set this thing down, or if I even hop on it, the back doesn't really move much. We don't have much sag, we don't have much set in. The whole thing is pretty stiff, so I don't think it's gonna be incredibly compliant over the small chop. I think instead of kind of dancing over stuff, it's gonna have the kind of skittery, you're on the end of the shocks, but when you wanna turn it up and hammer through moguls at Tug Hill or end of the day trash that's 12 to 18 inches or more, you'll be able to just fly right through that stuff and this thing's not gonna care one bit. To reiterate the differences in the spring rates alone real quick, because I know I've been talking about a bunch of other stuff in between. Front track shock, SnoPro, 90 to 250 pound progressive spring. So you start at a 90 pound rate, you finish at a 250 by the time you get through the full stroke. On your RXC, 250 pounds straight. Then to compare the rear torsions again, you're looking at a 0.359 on the SnoPro versus a 0.394 inch stock diameter here of your square. You're looking at a 100-degree start rate for your tail on the back where it mounts on your adjuster here on the SnoPro versus a 90-degree tail on the RXC. That tail kind of dictates your preload starting point. So you got a little bit less preload on this, but you have a much stiffer rate at 16.5 pounds per degree for your movement on this end versus 12 pounds per degree on the SnoPro. I'm kind of traditionally, whether we're talking rear springs, front springs, whatever, I'm a bit more of the camp of less preload with your appropriate rate instead of piling preload in to band-aid a rate that isn't accurate. So I do like seeing a less preload starting point on the RXC. I think that means that they've got the rate a little bit more fine-tuned for the application of this sled. I'm not saying that the SnoPro is out to lunch or out of whack. I just usually prefer and like to run stuff that has less preload to start with. And then at the very back of the RXC over here, we've got 4-wheel axle, 7.12, I'm assuming 0.125, but the part number kind of ran out there. So I'm assuming the traditional 7 1/8 inch rear wheel. Arctic Cats of the past have normally had the 8-inch rear wheel. The 2024 RXC 600, and this is one we'll touch on now, we'll get onto the drivers a little bit. The 2024 RXC 600 had an 8-tooth driver up front, gave it a little bit more clearance up front, along with the wheel change at the back of the RXC, right? Normally these cats come with an 8-inch rear wheel. On the 2024 RXC 600, you had an 8-tooth driver up front, which gave you a little bit more ground clearance for moguls and stuff like that. On the 2025 858, they kept all the gear ratios essentially across the 858 lineup all the same. So we've got a 9-tooth extrovert driver up here. Don't need to be seeing my notes. We've got a 9-tooth extrovert driver up front here. And then in order to fit everything with the skid and all that in here, they had to knock down the rear wheel size a little bit. So that's why we've got the 7s out back. If you go to the SnoPro, you're looking at a 9-tooth 286 pitch driver as well, but this has involutes, which means it doesn't have the external little drivers that stick through the window of the track. On paper, I think the SnoPro is gonna have more top end because it's got Invo drivers, which are shown to take less to drive and move the track because you're not having to pull that little extrovert driver out of the window of the track. It can just kind of continue to roll, and you have a bigger wheel in the back of it as well. So that all helps decrease your rolling resistance, which translates to more mile per hour up top. But this is not designed to be a top end sled. Like, this is your corner to corner rocket that's just gonna handle all the trash. It's an RXC, it's a cross country race sled. It's not meant or built or intended to be a top end machine. So I'm not really disappointed in that change amongst this stuff one bit. One last thing to touch on before I get up, I just remembered the front axle mounting shaft here. I don't really know what I know they call it a front axle, but I feel like it's like the front torque arm mounting shaft or something. So front torque arm mounting shaft between the RXC and the SnoPro is a different part number. These do have a different front axle. I'm assuming this one's gonna be a little bit beefier for handling all the moguls and all that stuff. A couple other tidbits that I kind of forgot or just overlooked when I was talking about it. It's a lot of information, a lot of part numbers, a lot of stuff to go over and try to remember and then convey coherently. So apologies if there's some spots where I kind of stumbled over my words or something like that, but a lot to go over here. Anyway, small difference with the front shocks, right? Your QS3Rs on the RXC have a shock shaft diameter of roughly 15.8 millimeters. And then on the AC5S, you're looking at roughly 12.75 millimeters. And I say roughly because I just kind of got in there with the caliper, gave it a pinch, pulled it out and looked at it. I didn't really go trying to make sure it's perfectly square and whatnot. Gives you a little bit of an idea. You're looking at roughly a 3 millimeter difference on the shock shaft diameter. Moving right down my list here, the brake system, the master cylinders are the same part number, but the caliper, rotor, and pads are indeed completely different on the RXC versus the SnoPro. The RXC has a drilled rotor. It's definitely a little bit different material. It's a little shinier. It's a little cooler race looking, I guess. Other than that, I don't know what exactly is different on it. I can't tell you what the material is or anything like that, but it's very visibly different. The SnoPro has a traditional kind of round blank style rotor, full contact for the pad. As far as the pads go, I know the part number is different. I have no idea what the material composition is of each pad. No clue in that department. And then similar fashion, I don't know exactly what is different between the two calipers. However, the bolts holding the RXC caliper assembly together are substantially bigger than the bolts holding the caliper assembly together on the SnoPro. So I've got some B-roll footage of that stuff. I'll flash that in. Maybe I already did. Not really sure. I might overlay it. Never know how I'm going to edit it up. So either way, footage of that. Let's see, moving down the list, the clutching between the two is exactly the same all the way around, primary, secondary. As far as the belt drive system goes, they're both a 32 top gear, 58 bottom, same belt. We covered the driver difference. They're the same diameter. However, we have the extras versus the invos. Jack shaft is the same between the two. Same muffler, same pipe. Carbides are different. On the RXC, you've got a 4-inch carbide on a 1/2-inch host bar. So you got a pretty big diameter bar there, but only a little 4-inch carbide. And then on the SnoPro, you've got their 4-inch split carbides. The bell crank, the steering post, bell crank meaning the piece in the bottom that the steering post attaches to for the ratio steering. All that is the same amongst the two. And yeah, that kind of covers the deep dive differences between these two machines here. Obviously, the track is different. We got a 135 Cobra without the quiet drive, thankfully, on the RXC. 129 Ripsaw 1 with the quiet drive. If you watched the first video, you know that both of these tracks are coming off. We're putting ice arrowheads on both of these sleds. Like I touched on in the beginning of the video, some kind of comparisons of these spring rates and stuff to kind of get you guys an idea of the rates of the other sleds from other brands and how those ride. So you might have an idea kind of ahead of time of what to expect from these here. So on like a VR1 Polaris, right, the common complaints are that overall sprung and damped, pretty soft. It's okay if you're kind of out there cruising, but it's not really gonna handle the big 18-inch chop very well or the big end of the day trash stuff. You're gonna kind of end up blowing through that if you try to ride hard through it. On a VR1 up front, you're looking at an 80-pound spring straight rate. Your front track shock is a 90 to 280 progressive, but you don't have the assist from the torsion spring like you do on either of these, since that torsion spring is mounted up in front of the torque arm, which helps that front track shock through all those big mogul events. So in regards to the torsion springs, you have essentially the same size square bar for your stock of the coil, 3.59 inch between a VR1 and the SnoPro over here. On a VR1, you have an 80-degree tail for your starting preload. On the SnoPro, you have 100 degrees, so you get a little bit more preload there. On a VR1, you're looking at 11 pounds per degree, and on the SnoPro, you're looking at 12 pounds per degree. So out back for the torsion springs, you've got a little bit stiffer of a torsion spring, which is awesome because most people end up finding that the VR1 is too soft. So I think this torsion spring is really good, especially that it's a long tail. It's going to help the front track shock. I'm really liking what I'm seeing from Cat in terms of these base calibrations. I think this rear skid is going to be really, really fun, and I think it's going to have a pretty good broad window of what it can and will handle. We won't know till we get on the snow, but again, I like what I'm seeing here. So for current XCR, you're looking at 0.375 inch, 80-degree start, and 13 pound per degree. So you're closer on an XCR to what you have on this SnoPro. However, stock XCR is, again, not a long tail, does not get that mounting point up in front of the rearmost mounting point for the front torque arm. So hopefully the visual cues and where I pointed to and showed everything earlier in the video help you guys kind of keep up and convey with what I'm talking about here in terms of those relationships of mounting points, because I know front, rear, torque arm, this, that, it can get kind of confusing. And then if you want to get real nerdy with the torsion spring talk, we can cover the long tail quickly. So a stock cross-country Polaris long tail torsion spring, you're looking at 18 pounds per degree and a 95-pound start rate. I don't have the diameter of it. I could go measure those. Don't really feel like it, but you get an idea. 18 pounds per degree, quite a bit stiffer. That's even stiffer than the RXC here. Moderate preload start and a pretty stiff overall degree. However, if you go with a light duty torsion spring from a cross country, you're looking at an 87 degree start, so less preload on the start, and then a 16 pound per degree rate, which I have the light duties in the white VR1. However, that's a 129. So I had to shorten the spring, shorten the mounting point. So they are probably closer to that 18 pound degree mark, and they work really well in that thing for me and what I'm doing. So with that in mind, I don't necessarily think that the rear of the RXC is going to be too stiff in the rear arm and torsion spring department. But again, not going to know till I get it out on the snow. I know this has been kind of more suspension talk than it has been anything else calibration wise, but that's because everything else is the same. The engine package, the clutching, the gearing, that's all the same on these two. There's not really much to compare there, and I kind of like suspension stuff. I'm a suspension nerd, so I enjoy talking about that stuff. I hope this helped you guys. I really like where these two sleds are in their base calibrations. I think for their intended purposes, they are pretty damn close to being on the money from where I would like to see them start, which is great. I am by no means a professional suspension engineer. I know enough to get in trouble, if we can put it that way. I think the RXC is going to do its job of not really being all that compliant in the small stuff, but when you want to go turn it up and drive through the trash, this thing is going to handle it all. If you're looking for a pretty broad compliance window, this thing out of the box seems pretty good. Depending on the shock calibration and how the damping is, this thing could be right on the money, right out of the box, and not really need anything, which would be very awesome to see. So I hope all this information helped kind of display some of the differences between the two and maybe help you guys moving forward for next year if you haven't ordered something for this year. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Let's go, baby. Not even at a break-in. Come on now.